It's a cliche that whenever you do time, real time, it blends together. The days, the weeks, the years all become one experience. It makes it difficult to precisely place stories in a timeline. So, for the next couple of Phil Spector stories that I tell, I'm not going to try to place them specifically exactly whenever they happened. It'll be more of a free-form narrative. And I'll just tell the stories that occur to me. One Phil Spector story that I know exactly whenever it happened is whenever he arrived on the yard at SADF in Corcoran, California. I know this because it was one of my duties as lieutenant's clerk to process the paperwork that moved inmates from the reception area to E-Yard, where I was living, and then to the building that they'd be housed in. So I processed the paperwork for Phil Spector whenever he arrived at E-Yard, and I remember noting the name, thinking, hey, is that guy that was on the news, Spector? And sure enough, it was. I remember him coming onto the yard, and I might not have given that day a second thought, except a pretty interesting occurrence happened that evening, and the next day, I got to read the paperwork on it. Apparently, about a half hour after Phil rolled into the building and was probably setting up his cell, unpacking his stuff, making his bed, that kind of thing, an inmate had come up to his door. We're going to call this guy Clever Bastard. Clever had rolled up to the door and, tap-tapped on the window and, hey, excuse me, you're inmate Spector, right? And Phil would come up to the window, yeah, that's me, I'm Phil. A Clever Bastard had looked at his name tag on the door, looked at him and said, hey Phil, if you want to get on things like canteen and packages and you want to be able to come out to the yard, you need to fill out some paperwork. I'm in charge of making sure all this paperwork gets filled out. You do want that stuff, right? Phil told him, yeah, of course I want that. And so Clever had told him, all right, well, kick your inmate ID out the door, and I'll go make a copy of it and get the paperwork filled out, and I'll bring some stuff for you to sign, all right? And Phil had taken his inmate ID, probably, a little something like that guy right there, and he'd slid it under the door, and Clever had taken it and walked out of the building, and he was never heard from again. No one knows which inmate it was that stole Phil Spector's ID. But I have it on good authority that he covertly passed it off to his wife or girlfriend or whoever it was that visited him that weekend, and it was on eBay and sold for $150 3 days later. I suppose that if you're wealthy and famous, it makes some aspects of doing time easier, but if you're also gullible, it can make some aspects of doing time a lot harder. In fact, as soon as he arrived on the yard, the vultures started circling. People were looking for a way to get some of Phil Spector's money. Not surprising, you figure it's a bunch of con men in prison. One guy that I know ended up with a lot of Phil's money was the drug dealer on the yard. I've mentioned before that there were a bunch of elderly and infirm inmates at SADF on E-Yard, a lot of terminal patients. And they received pain medication. Morphine was the big ticket pill that a lot of them received. And they would make a living out of cheeking it, they called it, where they would hide the pill in the back of their mouth whenever they pretended to take it, and then spit it into a cup or a plastic bag or something, save up a couple of them, and sell them to the local drug dealer. The drug dealer, in turn, would find the drug addicts on the yard, or in some cases just guys that had actual pain management problems and weren't medicated heavily enough and had the money to supplement their medication. And he would sell these morphines to them at a substantial profit. I don't want to go into the specifics of the deal that this guy had with Phil Spector, but I can tell you that Phil was supplementing his psychiatric medications with a lot of morphine and giving this guy a significant amount of money for those morphine. It wasn't clear to me exactly how heavily medicated Phil was until one day I was walking him to another building. He'd requested to be moved from 5 block, where he was housed, to 3 block. This isn't that uncommon of a thing. Inmates do ask to be moved occasionally, and so long as the officers don't mind processing the paperwork, it's not a big deal. But the officers were concerned because Phil Spector was a high-profile inmate. He had lawyers, reporters spoke to him. If it turned out that he was moving to another building and was then taken advantage of, possibly hurt, anything like that, it could be embarrassing for staff and the administration. So an officer had approached me and asked, hey, Channel, would you mind taking Phil to the building he wants to move in and make sure he's going to be all right? Introduce him to some guys that won't take advantage of him, make sure that he understands the situation he's being moved into. It wasn't a big deal, and I didn't mind. This wasn't the type of thing I generally did, but it was also a way to help somebody that needed help, so I was okay with it. I walked Phil into 3 Block, and as soon as we stepped into the building, he tugged on my shirt, and he looked up at me. He was a shorter guy, and he said, "She's beautiful." I looked at who Phil was looking at, and it was a transgender inmate named Carlita. I was well acquainted with Carlita. We were friends even, I suppose. And it's not surprising that Carlita had stood out to Phil. There were a number of transgender inmates at SADF, and Carlita was probably the prettiest one on the yard. She was a legitimately gorgeous person. And I was well acquainted with her. And I don't mean any discourtesy to Carlita, and I'm not trying to misgender her, but I looked at Phil and expressed to him, I said, "Phil, that's a dude, right? That's a biological man." I only did this because Phil's demeanor, the way that he was speaking of her, made it clear that he thought that Carlita was a biological woman, that we were at a co-ed prison somehow. And Phil responded aggressively. He said, No, her at the table playing cards. She's beautiful. And I expressed to him again. I said, "Phil, I know who you're talking about. That's Carlita. She's actually really nice. Would you like to meet her? I'll take you over and introduce you to her. She'll like you. But I'm just making sure you understand that is a biological man, that we're not at a co-ed prison." And he got upset. He did the thing that he would do occasionally when he got upset, where he stomped his foot and he looked up and he said, "No, her at the table." I gave up at this point. It was clear that Phil was just incapable of processing the information that I was trying to provide to him. If this was the 50s, I guess, I can understand somebody not being able to grasp the concept of a transgender person. That an individual might have been born male but identify as female and live as such in an institutional environment. But Phil Spector was a Hollywood music producer. He'd run into this before, hadn't he? I could only assume that it was the medication that he was on was making it just impossible for him to process information that he, I guess, didn't want to process. As it turned out, Phil did spark up a friendship with Carlita. They interacted loosely for a couple of months. I'd see them together every now and then. And as it turned out, he did not move into 3 Block. He decided to stay where he was. I don't know what aspect of the new building intimidated him, but he didn't like it there. It was unusual for me to be walking Phil from one building to another. He actually had a guy that he paid for that. He had a bodyguard. Ex-Hell's Angel named Hogg. I was well acquainted with him too. We were friendly. I mentioned this because one day, 6 months later, we'll say, Hogg had approached me and went, "Hey, Aaron, I want to get at you." Yeah, I liked Hogg. I said, "Yeah, Hogg, what's up, man? How you doing? What can I help you with?" And Hogg told me, "Oh, listen, I'm Phil Spector's bodyguard, right?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely. I know you're Phil Spector's bodyguard. I bet you get paid pretty well for that, don't you? He's a millionaire." Hogg went, "Oh yeah, I get paid well, but that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I'm moving. They're transferring me to another prison. And Phil and I were talking, and you're the guy, man. Do you want the job? You're the only person we could think of that both of us really respect and think would do a good job of it." I'm going to be honest, my eyes turned into little dollar signs whenever he said that I could have that job. Figure Phil Spector is a multi-millionaire. This pays, what, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month? I'm going to be able to save up some money. I'm going to help my wife pay off some bills. This is going to be awesome. So I told him, hell yes, I want the job. Sign me up. What do I got to do? What's it actually entail? Hog told me, well, it's pretty easy. What you do is you get up, about 8:30, 9, and you go find Phil, and you just kind of hang out with him all day long. And then at the end of the day, 8:30, 9, you walk him back to his cell. And all you really got to do is if somebody's being a little aggressive or rude, you put yourself between them and him. If they're asking for autographs or to borrow money or anything like that, you get in the way and tell him, hey, leave him alone. He doesn't want to deal with you right now. It's easy. It's not a hard job at all. So, all right, yeah, I can do that, absolutely. Hey, what's this pay? He said, oh man, he pays $180 a month. Hog, you get paid $180 a month to work 12 hours a day every day? Dude, that's like 50 cents an hour, right? No, I get paid better than that. No, Hog, it's 50 cents an hour. That's what you're making to be a bodyguard. No, I make $180 a month, man. I didn't argue the point, but I turned the offer down cold. That was not a job I wanted at 50 cents an hour. Don't get me wrong, I guess it would have been a raise. I was earning 17 cents an hour as the program clerk at the time. But the program clerk job, it had a real potential to maybe get me out a little early. I had officers that were writing little letters to put in my file about how professional I was, how hard I worked. Working for Phil Spector as a bodyguard had no chance of getting me out and had a real chance of getting me into trouble. I mean, a bodyguard by definition gets into fights occasionally maybe, or at least puts himself in harm's way. So I turned the job down cold. I know that most of the stories that I've had to tell about Phil Spector have had to do with money in some way, and that's because I think that his self-worth and his mind was really based around the number of zeros in his bank account as much as anything else. But I don't just want that to be the subject of everything I have to say about him. Still, these stories get me thinking about the value of a dollar, what you're actually paying whenever you pay for something. You take that ID that some weirdo bought off the internet for $150 as some strange killer memorabilia. That ID wasn't worth $150. I mean, sure, it was $5 worth of plastic, and I guess it was a collectible item, but nobody wants that thing, right? That's a weird thing to buy. But I guess the guy who bought it felt like he was getting a good deal. And then conversely, how about paying a bodyguard? The guy who stands between you and the wet end of a knife and 3 angry gang members that have decided to make a name for themselves. 50 cents an hour. Do you know what you get for 50 cents an hour? You get somebody who's going to pretend like they didn't see there was a problem and walk off in the other direction, and you're going to be left dealing with those 3 gang members by yourself. Whenever there's something that's important to you, your personal safety, for God's sakes, your health, your life, you'll get what you pay for, and 50 cents an hour isn't enough. It's a miracle that Hogg worked for that low wage. And if you do find yourself in prison in a life or death scenario, if you find yourself trying to find a way to protect yourself and maybe a couple of bucks will make the difference, don't lowball the guy. Pay what it's worth, or you won't get what you thought you paid for.